19:28 through 40. After he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When he had come near Bethphage and Bethany at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt which has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it.'" So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They said, "The Lord needs it." Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. As he was now approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out."
Okay, all right, great. Thank you so much, John. And you are now excused to eat your dinner.
Thank you.
So just before I are you kidding me? That's Linda Berg's picture? Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Nice, very nice. So just before I make some comments then about the actual passage, I just sort of want to remind us, we are, I guess last week we had gotten all the way up into chapter 19 and up to the city of Jericho, which, as we've mentioned, was a suburb to a certain extent of Jerusalem, was associated with the kings of Israel, presumably through an ancient enthronement festival that there's a significant amount of scholarship sort of agrees about. And then there are these different passages, particularly the one where David actually brings the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. There was one more little episode that we had last week that I just decided we needed to move on from, and that was the scene with Zacchaeus, which is, of course, an endearing story. It only shows up in Luke, but I felt that we kind of needed to go ahead and move ourselves forward. So now we have now completed, essentially, with a couple of jumps here and there, the largest section of the Gospel of Luke, which was the travel narrative, and we are now entering into a shorter piece, which is sometimes described as sort of the ministry in Jerusalem. So Jesus starts out in Galilee and then travels sort of in a pretty circuitous way through the countryside, etc., through various towns and things of that nature. And then he comes now to Jerusalem, and this, of course, is the story that precedes his passion story. And I think it'd be fair to say that this is the sort of the end, the last of the final days of his earthly ministry. We get to hear about his final words. We are going to skip some of this material. As I mentioned before, we want to make sure that we move along and make sure that we get to the resurrection. We only have a couple classes left. So this is a scene, if, having just passed through Holy Week, only 3-4 weeks ago, we all know and would be somewhat familiar with the triumphal entry. And there's I think, important, interesting background here, particularly in terms of Luke's portrayal and the earlier things that he had to say about the Roman authorities way, way back at the beginning of this gospel story, and that some of this comes back now in this scene. One of the things I think is really interesting here is that if you kind of are familiar with what is actually happening in this scene, you come to realize that this really is one of the most explicitly political scenes in the gospel story, certainly in terms of Luke's telling of the story. because of this scene in the history of its reception and interpretation, it has sometimes been abused by the church, right? The scene of triumph it has not always, the church has not always paid attention to the things that that sort of make for the difference of what's happening here, vis-a-vis the contrast that I think Luke is imagining. And what I think is the backdrop is a phenomenon that most people would have been somewhat familiar with, and that is simply a triumph, what is known as a triumph. Triumphs were quite common across the ancient world. The Roman triumph makes, of course, the most sense here because of the context of imperial Rome, as well as what I'm going to make an argument here in just a moment, or at least a sort of a point of saying that in some ways, the contrast that Luke had developed at the very beginning of telling of the story of Jesus, right, where Caesar Augustus makes a proclamation, and then that's countered by a divine proclamation, that same kind of contrast, I think, is at play here, in addition to other layers. So what was a Roman triumph? It's essentially, as I mentioned here, it was a triumphal procession that was meant to celebrate typically a political or military victory, and was meant to be an expression of power. It's to sort of celebrate how wonderful, amazing, and powerful a given power, force, or individual was. It typically marked a victory. And I think this is that image, that theme, you get that sense of, Jesus, in some ways, his ministry is kind of coming to a conclusion, and it's been quite successful to a certain extent up to this point. So you could kind of see how that might be at play in people's imagination. Now, in terms of the Roman background, the typical triumph it included the elements that I have on the screen here described, kind of listed out for you, right? The emperor or the general would march into Rome. They would be riding a regal animal or a chariot. They would be wearing the victory laurels, and they would have prisoners of war in tow behind them. And one of the most famous images that we have from the ancient world is actually from the sacking of Jerusalem. There's actually a frieze component of one of the triumphs in Rome that shows the general kind of bringing in to the city of Rome the spoils from the temple, and clearly you can see depicted the great menorah being held as it kind of is brought into Rome. So that's a key part. Prisoners of war, crowds would have been waving palm branches. Sounds familiar, right? Even though in Luke's gospel there are no palm branches, interestingly enough. And then they would be shouting acclamations, and typically these would be, I think actually here I just pick up on an image that actually is not Roman. It's actually it's sort of ancient Jewish, ancient Israel, which is there's a scene somewhere, I think it's in First Kings, or maybe it's Second Samuel, where David and Saul are going into the city, and the people are like, Saul has slain his thousands, and David has slain his tens of thousands. But those are the kind of acclamations, right? That the key point here is that these are acclamations about victory in war, and therefore violent to a certain extent, and therefore also the way that the world works, right? It's kind of the idea. And I think one of the things that we've seen in the whole of the gospel story is that yes, Jesus adopts and adapts language like kingdom and kingship, but he means something profoundly different by that language than what you would find elsewhere. And so I think the same kind of thing here we could say is going on. The other thing that's interesting, particularly in terms of the Roman, and this is probably the case with other cultures, but I didn't get really a chance to check this, but after this entry, literally the parade went directly to the Pantheon, or the major kind of religious site in Rome. And there, the emperor or the general, probably, particularly the case for the emperor, would have offered sacrifices and thanksgiving and in cleansing for that. And so it's not strange, and given that background, that the very, basically one of the very next scenes after this one is Jesus going to the temple, though there are very specific kind of scriptural warrants for that, and we'll kind of bring those out as we move into it. Excuse me. In terms of Luke's version, so this is an entry that is described across the Synoptic Gospels. There just really are two things that I wanted to point out that I thought were unique. I'm sure there are other little unique things here and there, but these were two that I thought were worth highlighting. The first is what I've already mentioned, and that is this idea that we have a kind of return to that contrast that we heard about at the beginning of the story, right? Caesar Augustus, a son of God, that's how he described himself, makes a proclamation that people must obey. That is countered, of course, by the proclamation of Yahweh and the declaration of the true Son of God, who is going to come into the world. We have a similar kind of thing, I think, being imagined here, with a clear kind of contrast to the kings or emperors of this world. The second one is the background text, in particular for Luke's gospel, which certainly has resonance across the other gospels. But it is this text from Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, and that reads as follows. It says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion, shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now, obviously, the riding into the city on a donkey or a colt, that also appears in Mark and Matthew. But one of the things that I think is unique, and that perhaps Luke wanted to intensify this Zechariah sensibility, is that as you will see, people are not waving palm branches, rather they are laying their cloaks on the road, and which is a sign of humility. And so that may be there precisely to sort of enhance the sense of the difference of Jesus's kingship. And if we had kind of been doing this in the more sort of what we might say traditional or typical way, you would have seen that just before our verses, there's a parable. It's basically the culminating moment of the travel narrative, and that parable is about kingship. So this whole section is about kingship, and how people are called to live in the light of the kingship of Jesus, etc. So, but we had to skip that material, so I'm sorry. All right, so let's turn to break down some of the verses. All right, so first of all, I've broken this into it's like 6 sections here. Verses 28 and 29, which give us some kind of basic descriptions, but also some geographical mentions, that at least one of which is, I think, important to note as we think about the sort of biblical theological background of what's going on. So it says, after he'd said this, he went on ahead going up to Jerusalem. So that's literally, he's just had this kind of kingship parable. Now he's about to go and be proclaimed king. When he had come near Bethphage and Bethany at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, and we'll pick up that in just a second. All right, so what is important here is that not only is Zechariah 9:9 at play, But in Luke, in particular, the Mount of Olives plays an important role. In fact, what the scene that usually takes place in the quote unquote Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew and Mark does not take place there. It takes place rather on the Mount of Olives. Why is the Mount of Olives important? Well, the Mount of Olives was considered the place from which the Messiah would enter into the city of Jerusalem. And so it was associated with messianic expectations, with the beginning of what were called the messianic woes, etc. And so here is the actual text from Zechariah chapter 14. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies before Jerusalem on the east. And I think it's the Festival of Light, which no, I don't think it's Hanukkah. I feel like it's a different, maybe it's the Festival of Booths, but there's one major festival that really is very eschatologically oriented and features in particular the Mount of Olives and the East Gate that the Jews particularly celebrated, and it features pretty prominently also in the Gospel of John, as it turns out. The Mount of Olives also had sort of an indirect association with the Enthronement Festival as well, so that kind of is in keeping with some of the things that we encountered as we followed the story with the Jerusalems, or the Jericho scenes, I should say. All right, then we have kind of the largest section that I've broken down is the preparations for the meal and some of the details there and things that are going on. So let me kind of read through this, verses 30 through 36. So he sent two of his disciples saying, go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you untying it? Just say this, the Lord needs it. So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, why are you untying the colt? They said, the Lord needs it. Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. All right, so kind of a couple, two or three things here to notice. And this is going to occur again, by the way, when we come to the scene of the preparation for Passover. So there's scholars are kind of divided. Is this a prophetic moment where Jesus is telling them what they will find, or has Jesus already made preparations? I think I would probably go with this scene feeling more prophetic, but that the scene in preparation for the Lord's Supper feels a little bit more like preparations have been made. But again, you can kind of decide that as you will. What I think is really important, though, and I would suggest here, this is one of the reasons why I would go with the more prophetic component, and that is that, heady things are about to unfold. Basically chapter 20 is like, Jesus pretty much taking the scribes and Sadducees and chief priests to the woodshed in terms of his teaching. So there's going to be a lot of conflict. Jesus is going to be arrested, betrayed, executed, etc. So there's just a lot of up and down, I think is kind of the point that I'm trying to make. But in the midst of that confusion, what we might call human confusion, there is a sense, of course, in which God is still at work, right? And so I think that is kind of one of the things that this scene and other little details like this help us to be reminded that this is not simply an accident, right? Or is not simply something that's motivated only by the human actors who are certainly involved here in Jesus's arrests, etc. The second thing is, of course, the symbol of the colt, a colt that's never been ridden. This is basically the way that Mark describes the animal. So here Luke is very close to Mark. And as I mentioned here on the outline, Matthew and Zechariah also speak, they speak about a donkey. And so maybe there's sort of a interchangeability here. I think what's important are a couple of different things. Number one is that this is a draft animal, right? This is not a stallion. This is not an animal that would necessarily have pulled a chariot, right? This is a very humble animal that would not have been the go-to animal for any king or figure of royalty. And I think that fact is very important for highlighting the difference, of Jesus's kingship vis-a-vis Caesar Augustus or whoever else you want to put up next to that. The other thing, of course, is the having not been ridden, the animal to some extent is still at least presumably ritually pure, right? Hasn't been broken in, and therefore there's a kind of sense of holiness surrounding that. The last little detail, right, are the cloaks, and we've already mentioned this. That one of the things that's kind of interesting in Luke is that there are no palm branches, which my 5-year-old self, was very sad about, because I really love the palm branches on Palm Sunday. But Luke omits that. But what we do get is that Luke talks about people taking off their cloaks twice. We get once the cloaks being put on the animal, and then cloaks being laid on the ground. And I think whenever something appears twice, it's probably important, and particularly if it appears twice, within a few verses, and this is like one verse right after another. Well, this, of course, is a sign both of deference, but also to some extent of divestment, of humility. And so here comes the humble king, and the people, in a sense, play in with the drama. The humble king of Zechariah, and you get really a kind of a solemnity alongside of the festivity, because in just a minute, right, or at least by the time you get down there to the end, especially in verse 38, you really get a sense that it's starting to get a bit raucous in terms of this scene, but there's a sort of solemnity here that I think is also striking. All right, I'm going to kind of move us, if that's okay with everybody. I'll stop in a minute and we'll do some Q&A conversation or whatever. So verse 37, as he was now approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen. Now, I think there's a couple things here that I think are pretty amazing. One of them is to imagine the fact that Judas is with these guys, right? I mean, he has not, Satan has not entered into him. He's not left the entourage, and here he is, a part of this scene of proclamation. But the fact that these folks are starting now to acclaim him, that's what happened in a triumph, right? People began to shout acclamations and to cheer on the person who was coming into the scene, into the city, whichever city that might be. There's a connection here. If you go back and you look at the parable, and if I'd had time to kind of work our way through it, that comment there might make a little bit more sense. But you'll just have to take my word for it, I suppose, for now. One of the things, though, that I think is really amazing, and probably the most striking, is that they're not proclaiming that Jesus slew 1,000 people, or that he liberated a city by destroying all the people and taking all the booty and bounty. They are rather proclaiming in a loud voice, right? They're joyfully praising God for all the deeds of power that they've seen. Deeds of healing, deeds of restoration, the teaching, etc. So a very different picture, again, of what a triumph looks like, which doesn't, of course, probably shouldn't surprise us at this point in the gospel story. Then we turn to verse 38 and we get this, we start to actually hear the voices of the people in verse 38 saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Now, interestingly, this is a quotation with a slight alteration, which is very significant, but it comes out of Psalm 118, verse 26. And this was typically, as I say here, associated with Passover. We are obviously in the vicinity of Passover because Jesus is going to be, arrested and executed in the kind of context of Passover. The change, though, the one sort of important change to this verse is the insertion here. Rather than it saying, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord," it says, "Blessed is the King," right? So we have this conspicuous insertion of the language of king. We have a kingship scene. We just had a kingship parable. Kingship basically is central, I think, thematically and certainly theologically. It also echoes all the way back to the infancy narratives, right? Because back in chapter 2, verse 14, another version of this proclamation also is heard on the lips of the angels. All right, then we get verses 39 and 40, right, which constitutes the Pharisees' response to this. So I'll read this verse 39. "Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, order your disciples to stop.'" Now, I think obviously what they're saying could be read in different ways, but given the broader context of a Roman triumph, the insertion of the language of kingship, et cetera, the fact that this is a highly political scene, it seems to me that this is not so much the Pharisees objecting to the idea that Jesus might be Messiah. Rather, it is an objection to the danger, right? That to proclaim Jesus King is a very dangerous thing to do, and particularly given the presence of the Romans, right? That's what I mean here by the dangerous part, right? It is quite literally, in a sense, to confront Rome's claims to authority, sovereignty, etc. And so I think the Pharisees' attempts to silence these folks has far more to do with their fear than any sort of religious quibbling that they might have. The other thing that is interesting, given that we've sort of gone through, and the Pharisees have sort of been a constant companions through the story, is that they basically disappear now from the story. We don't hear about the Pharisees anymore. We start to hear about the chief priests, the scribes, and the temple elite, basically. That makes sense because the Pharisees, is what we know sociologically and historically speaking, tended to be based in a more rural sort of power base. Synagogue, which would have been sort of the main site for Pharisees and the Pharisaic movement. That's something that is especially prominent in the countryside because people can't go up to the temple every day. You can't walk 30 miles a day, or not necessarily even every day, every Sabbath, right? And so synagogue and Pharisees are out there, and who's sort of in the power base in the city? It's the priests, the priestly class, particularly the chief priests, the Sadducees, etc. So they are going to now become, they're going to come more and more to the forefront as Jesus's opponents. All right, so what about Jesus's response? And this is in verse 40. He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." All right. And I think this can be read pretty simply, which is something like, whether you understand what's happening here or not, it is happening. This is going to happen. And so, as I mentioned here, even if the nature of Jesus' kingdom is radically misunderstood, and I don't just mean by the Pharisees, I mean the disciples don't even understand it, right? Like it or not, it's unfolding, right? Jesus' kingship is certain. His identity as in that regard is going to be made plain, but in ways that would be profoundly different than what we might normally expect. Last little kind of detail piece is this is the first of several stone sayings that appear in this final portion of Luke. We get several, I think there's 3 other sayings that deal with stones. And I'm not sure why I included that. I think it was just a detail that I thought was interesting. So that's free of charge. Do with it as you will. So let me stop for a second and see thoughts, comments, questions, elaboration, whatever it is that you want to pause here for a minute.
I had just a thought on jumping on a unbridled colt that never been ridden might be kind of an exciting. The colt might not be all that hip on doing that.
That's true. That's true. That could make for that kind of energy could make for even more excitement in the crowd and in the scene.
I was thinking of the contrast of a traditional Roman triumph of the victor going to the temple to be cleansed and make offerings, and the contrast again between that and what happens here, which is he goes to the temple and instead of it cleansing him, he cleanses it. So it's not it. He's the one that makes it holy and clean, not the other way around.
That's right. That's right. And we're gonna jump into that here in just a minute. That's a good observation. But that sense of reversal, right? That kind of upside down kingdom element that is especially prominent, I think, in Luke's gospel, is really on display here, in a way that is that's almost obvious, I think, in some ways, right? Or that would be the most obvious. Like if you were an authority figure and you were reading this text and you weren't necessarily a Christian, you would kind of know what they were up to, right? The challenge that this represented.
The palm branches I found interesting too. I was aware that the one gospel mentions them and the other one doesn't. And that, I won't say it troubled me, but I always found it interesting. But the fact that this was a very common thing to the people, whether you put it in or don't, seems like it wasn't a big deal. If it was a unique praise for Jesus, then yeah, I imagine both of them would have put it in. But
yeah, because you could assume, like, if there's a triumph, there's going to be palm branches.
Yeah,
kind of a thing.
Why mention it?
Yeah, there's not even any point really in some ways, and I mean Luke omits it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. But that's right. That's right.
Well, it does reinforce the kingship concept because, as you said, a great general could have a triumph after a victory without being the king. Certainly in the past, that was true before emperors. But here to not let the animal that the king is riding touch the ground and to put yourself in front of it, it's the equivalent of a genuflecting or a prostrating yourself. It's laying down yourself so that the king is not disturbed, essentially. And it's a response that you give to a king, not to just any guy, or even any general.
That's right.
I thought it was really interesting when you said that the Pharisees, I mean, they weren't so much feeling a threat towards their power, but they were worried more about how it would look to Rome. I never thought about that before.
Yeah, and one of the things that strikes me, and I'll kind of I'm in the middle of completing the trial scenes, which is sort of next, in our story. But the way that Luke in particular, and I think you could probably make this case for all the Gospels, but I guess I'll just speak to Luke. Luke makes it relatively clear that the thing that really motivates Pilate is keeping a lid on things. It's law and order, essentially. That's what he's interested in, and so the Pharisees' fear is kind of well founded. And I think what we know from the historical record through Josephus and other sort of Roman records is that Pilate had no compunction to meting out severe penalties for unruly crowds, entities, etc., during his time as prefect, or whatever his precise title was. So there's some real kind of historical reality to that, I think.
That's super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, totally, Mary.
There's definitely both sides of it there, not so much in this one, but some of the others. I mean, you do get some more sense of their being affronted at this, what they clearly recognize as being a godlike or Messiah-like circumstance, and them, feeling once again, you can't have your people calling you God because you're not God. And Jesus is saying, yeah, actually I am. I mean, not, it's not so many words, but I think the political aspect is a critical one. And it's certainly what, as you said, in the trials, they're particularly worried about that. And they use that as they're worried about losing their position if the Romans crack down. And they're worried about being essentially blamed by the Romans for what goes on.
Well, on the basis of their accusations, particularly in Luke,
Is
are
that he claims to be, yeah.
And it's not only that. I think the one that actually wins out, the one that really wins out, is that he's been disturbing the people.
Yep.
Which has a kind of tragedy connected to it, and it will come back to that, I'm sure, when we get into it. All right, well, this is great, good conversation. Let's move us forward. We're going to skip a couple verses. 4 or 5, there's a little scene, there's a unique actually to Luke, where Jesus laments, in a sense, his coming in, but we're going to skip over that and move to the temple scene, because I feel like this is indelibly connected to the triumphal entry. So can I get a volunteer who's willing to read these verses?
Yeah, I can do it. Then he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling things there. And he said, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Every day he was teaching in the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him, but they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were spellbound by what they heard.
All right. Okay, so I basically, rather than breaking down every single word in these verses, I just have kind of 4 points that I want to make in terms of the importance of this scene, and of course the way that Luke tells the story. The first thing is that this is obviously a symbolic act, right? Jesus is going to cleanse the temple by attempting to run folks out, but they're going to come back. But the symbolism here is very significant. And I myself, I'm sure you as well, have always sort of thought, been kind of intrigued by the idea that in some ways these people, oh, did I freeze up?
Oh, you're fine.
Okay, you guys all froze up on me for some reason.
So we were spellbound by your teaching.
Yeah, I was like, it must be me. what I was saying is that I've always kind of thought, in some ways, these people belong there because people can't necessarily drive animals to the temple to be, sacrificed, etc. The practice that we kind of know based on documentation like Josephus and others, when they describe things that are going on in the temple, is typically that people brought their money and they purchased what they could afford to purchase, given whatever ritual that they were planning to do. So the presence of these people in some ways feels like a necessity. The problem, though, at least from the language that Jesus offers to us, is that it has become an expression of injustice. And I think there are a few sort of commentators that will break down. I didn't get a chance to really go into this in depth. So if there's someone who knows about this a little bit more, you could certainly speak into it. But the location of these, the folks who are buying and selling here, presumably made it difficult for people like, the Gentiles to come into the temple, right? So the court of the Gentiles, in other words, began to be taken up with the buying and selling of animals. And that then turned this into what Jesus describes it as, right? A den of robbers. The second thing that we want to note in terms of this kind of critique of injustice, and there's probably more detail that we could bring in, I suppose, to fill that out, is that the temple being cleansed is is an element of expectation, depending on which messianic tradition you're looking at. So there is a messianic tradition that expects.
Oh, you're frozen up.
Oh, am I?
Nope.
Am I frozen up now?
No,
You're okay now.
No, you're fine.
Okay, all right. So that might have been you, Rick. I don't know. You might have been.
No,
you might have been.
All I know is all of a sudden you just froze still.
I was deep in thought. I was thinking. Okay, so
switch in
there's
the matrix.
that's right. There's there is this expectation that the Messiah will come and essentially refound the temple. That's sort of the language that's usually used, and that's a way of conceptualizing the cleansing. So in some sense, Jesus is symbolically also here refounding the temple. This is an expectation again from Malachi 3:11, that you can kind of check that out. Now, I think this third point might be the most important. The first one is clearly important insofar as it maintains, it keeps us in a basic theme that we've seen throughout Luke's gospel, which is this concern for the poor, right? That the kingdom of God actually belongs to them. And the site that is supposed to be the place where divine and human commerce happens has turned into a zoo of buying and selling, right? It's not a place where you can easily meet God or be met by God. Then you have this messianic expectation. But the other thing, of course, is that any act of cleansing requires a sacrifice, right? And so there's a kind of sense of foreshadowing of the passion that's coming our way, right? I think we can see here, right, this event in a way begins the process to some extent of what Jesus will pursue in his offering himself and being faithful unto death. It's also, of course, an act of provocation, right? So, I think that's another one. I don't know if I had a place to put that, so I just kind of stuck it right here. But, Jesus is killed. He's not killed in this gospel because of the things that he says about the temple. That's actually does play out a little bit more. I think it's in Matthew and Mark. But clearly, you've come to like the center of power and are doing things that are profoundly provocative, turning over tables and upsetting the status quo. You are, ensuring not just resistance, but outright, violent retaliation, which of course is where we're going to be heading for Jesus. The last thing to note, which I think is particularly important, is let's see, I want to make sure that I do repeat this in just a second, but I think it's important to note here that we see Jerusalem is divided, at least initially, right? It's divided between the elite and the powerful who cannot stand Jesus and who really would like to rid themselves of him on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the quote unquote people, right? Who are in this case, they're spellbound by what they hear. We're going to hear, you would, if we were able to work through all of chapter 20, you would hear other places where they are pleased and delighted with what Jesus says and does. But the community itself is divided. And one of the things that Luke goes out of his way to make clear in his telling of the story is that the real motor or kind of primary agent involved in putting Jesus to death, that the responsibility of that does not lay with the people, it lays with the leadership. It lays with the elite. And that's particularly important to Luke in ways that are distinct in Luke's telling of the story, even in relation to the other synoptic gospels. Okay, let me stop because I'm going to skip us about 2 chapters. So let me see what kind of comments, questions, thoughts you all might have before we make that move.
Well, the phrase, the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people, I never really thought about the leaders of the people, and certainly there were leaders of the people that wanted to cause a revolution, wanted to overthrow the government. I mean, there was all kinds of, so, I mean, that is another group that I hadn't thought about. People were threatened by not their coup, but a coup that Jesus was going to enact.
Well, that's possible. I think the chief priests, the scribes, the Sadducees, like whatever groups we have, even if they are sort of in collusion with Rome, it's probably a cynical collusion, right? I mean, it's not because they're truly devoted to Rome in any sense. It's really that they are devoted to themselves staying in power or to enriching themselves in whatever way they can. So, but yeah, that would be another group. And who precisely populates that group, I'm not entirely sure myself. I don't know that the commentators even mentioned that, but that's interesting.
Well, Barabbas would know.
Barabbas, yeah, I'm sure Barabbas would know. Yeah. We'll talk to him next week.
I was thinking about your provocative act comment and how how Paul got himself thrown out of Ephesus because all of the makers of the Artemis rather which is it, Artemis or Athena? No, I've got
Artemis.
I think it's
Artemis.
Yeah,
Artemis they were going to lose their money, lose their business.
Right. Yeah, it's a clear entwining of religious, political, and economic power.
The Ephesians. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
His violence in the temple being a foreshadowing, getting rid of the sacrifice was something I'd never looked at it in those terms before, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, if he is cleansing the temple, a typical act of cleansing requires something like a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain sense in which this is a kind of proleptic foreshadowing, that the sacrifice that he is going to offer, right, that is sort of what this points to. I think that's right.
And those people will no longer be needed.
Presumably. And I think by the time that Luke is writing, I mean, I personally think that Luke is probably authored after the temple's been destroyed, more than likely, just after, probably in the 80s or something. But that's right. And not long.
How does this parallel the Maccabees' cleansing of the temple?
You'll have to say more, Charles. I'm not as familiar with the book of I know the Maccabees story is sort of an outline, but not in great detail.
No, I can't say anymore. That was a question, not
Okay.
not an observation, Kristen.
Yeah, I mean, the story of the Maccabees is important in part because it is like resistance literature. The Jews are resisting Antiochus Epiphanes in that story, but there are clearly people who object to the Maccabean revolt, and I don't mean Romans, I mean or Greeks, I mean other Jews, because it is the Maccabean revolt that actually produces the Essene community that sets up camp around the Dead Sea, or at least that we know about from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they viewed the entire priestly class as completely illegitimate. And they anticipated, they talk about it in their scrolls, a cleansing of the temple and of the temple apparatus, because it's effectively been defiled by the people who are currently overseeing it. So that was one of their main gripes. And they have these very fantastical documents, like these what are called battle scrolls, where the sons of light against the sons of darkness. And the sons of darkness are, in part, the people in control of the temple. So there are some elements here, I suppose, that kind of link up to that, but that's about the best I can do. It's a great question, though.
There's certainly a long history of Israel, Judah, the temple needing to be brought back, rediscovering the law, rediscovering God, having to throw out all of their household gods and temple things and their Asherah poles and their high places and, all the rest of that stuff. Repeatedly, it would be the same thing. Every time they'd be brought back, they would have to get rid of all that stuff and kind of refresh it, start over again.
Yeah, and the other thing that strikes me too is we're going to skip over the material, but in chapter 21, Jesus is in the temple, and this is the scene where people are sort of marveling at the temple. And he says, I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left on top of the other. And he kind of just, he predicts the destruction of the temple and then the destruction of Jerusalem itself. But in reference to that, one of the scholars I was working with in this commentary mentioned that a scene like that is actually, you can find that in a lot of different literature, where a figure will be in a place of great renown depicting its destruction. And so, there could be an element there that's at play here as well, with the cleansing of the temple too. So I just don't, I don't know. All right, well, let's move forward. And by forward, I mean, we really are going to skip over 2 chapters. So if I could get a volunteer who's willing to read from chapter 22.
Sure, I can do that.
All right.
Now the festival of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was near. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to put Jesus to death, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers of the temple police about how he might betray him to them. They were greatly pleased and agreed to give him money. So he consented and began to look for an opportunity to betray him to them when no crowd was present.
Okay, so I've got a couple of comments here to make. first I've got let me just make a couple comments about what we just skipped, and then I'll make some sort of generalized comments about the section that we're kind of entering into. So we really just touched the surface of the ministry in Jerusalem scene, and there really are two big things that essentially happen in chapter 20. Are a series of confrontations between Jesus and his opponents. And this is the place, chapter 20, where they come and they ask him, oh, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And you have the whole show me a coin scene. Actually, the very next scene, right after the temple cleansing, the first thing they ask him is, by what authority are you doing this? So almost to the point where they kind of understand the symbolic nature of what he's doing, and they're kind of wondering, by what authority. That whole section in chapter 20 ends basically with Jesus kind of shutting them down. They'll come and ask him a question, and then he will, in good rabbinic fashion, really, he will ask them a counter question. And so it's, I think it'd be fair to say that that chapter is a great place if you want to understand how rabbis kind of argued with each other. It's a pretty good example of that, that we have sort of other corroborating texts that kind of show us that. So it ends, though, with Jesus kind of shutting them down with a question about, whose son is the Messiah really? Is he really David's son? I mean, yeah, but no, right? He's greater than David. And it ends with the text saying, and no one dared ask him another question. So that's chapter 20. And then chapter 21 really is what is sometimes called the synoptic apocalypse. And these are the last public words of Jesus. They are an apocalypse is, a discourse or a genre of literature or speech that deals with the end, right? The end of things. And what we have this synoptic apocalypse basically show up pretty much in the same place across the three gospels. And I think what it does, the three synoptic gospels, I think what it does is it sets the tone, right? It's very odd in some ways to think that the last public words of Jesus are apocalyptic. On the one hand, it seems kind of natural to a certain extent, but on the other hand, it's kind of odd because the whole of his ministry has been so taken up with care for the poor, love, etc. And what you really get is this discourse on the coming apocalyptic trial. And I think the reason for that, at least one of the principal reasons that I would argue, is that the gospel authors understood Jesus's passion as itself a kind of apocalypse. That what Jesus is going to undergo, the trial that he's going to undergo, is more than simply the physical brutality. There is something else actually at stake beyond his sort of physical endurance. It's something tantamount to the essential event for all of human history, which is typically the way an apocalypse is kind of understood as. So those words end, and then we move into really what I think is a scene of intimacy, which is kind of the last scene before Jesus's arrest and sort of the train of his execution gets up and running. So what can we say then as we turn into these verses? And here's these are sort of some of the background. So chapter 22, 1 through 23, 56, this is typically described as the Passion narrative proper. It deals with sort of the last events on the final day. I mean, basically stretching from Thursday into Friday of Jesus's life. We have the supper scene. We have the scene in Gethsemane, even though Luke doesn't put it in Gethsemane. We have the trial and we have the execution. I think it's important to note, as I've kind of put it in your outline, that in all the Gospels, the Passion narrative really is quite disproportionate in its length in relation to the rest of the gospel. Even if we just go with sort of the traditional idea that Jesus ministers for 3 years, well, I mean, what did we get? Like 10, 15 chapters covering about 3 years. And we get here, pretty extended, like condensed material that deals with one single day. I think the reason for that is pretty straightforward, which is that this is the central problem, right? It's the central event in a certain way, but it's also the central problem that the Messiah should be executed. Right? That was yes, there are lineaments of that you can certainly find in the Old Testament, obviously, but that's not necessarily an uncontroversial thing to say. And so it does make a lot of sense that the Christian texts would pay special attention to understanding what happened here in these events, and trying to bring out the meaning of them. Now in Luke, there's just a couple of things. I'm sure there are several other emphases that we could list. I just list 2 here. One is the interesting parallel, and I think that one of the reasons for this, of course, is Luke himself is more than likely Hellenistic, a Gentile, and so Jesus is portrayed in some ways as almost a philosopher, and this is particularly the case in the supper scene. And I don't know that we're going to deal with the teaching, scene, but if you look at the way that Jesus is portrayed in the supper scene, and then even into the garden scene where the prayer happens, there's a kind of stoic resignation almost at play. And so scholars have kind of picked up on that. And that's different than like Mark. You really get this kind of like passionate, almost doubt, like Jesus feels kind of profoundly human in some ways, which I think is not as obvious here in Luke. The other thing is, though, is something that I mentioned before, and that is that Luke, certainly among all the Gospels, but particularly if you compare him to like Matthew or John, he clearly makes it pretty clear that the people responsible, in a sense, for Jesus's death are not the populace as a whole, but rather the leadership. And so the place at the end, it is true that at the end the people are going to be involved, but they are never sort of the central drivers. And you get the feeling that probably they are kind of being manipulated far more than they are driving things as they unfold. The last thing to highlight, which is the case across all the 4 of the Gospels, is the Passover context. That is the context in which Jesus's last day, his execution, takes place. There are some differences between the Gospels in this regard. Is it precisely on Passover? Is it the day before Passover? Is it a preparation day? The different Gospels offer slightly different nuances on that. But Passover as the general context is an agreed upon space and place, which I think provides a lot to think about in terms of what this means. And I mentioned here even the Talmud, which does mention Jesus, talks about him having been executed during the Passover period. So we have an additional external kind of witness, I suppose we could say. Now, what was the Passover? Passover is not the same thing as the Day of Atonement, right? It's a different celebration, and it's a celebration of what? Liberation, right? Liberation from bondage in Israel, or sorry, not Israel, in Egypt. So Israel is liberated from bondage in Egypt. And the Passover celebrations are described in these texts here, as I mentioned. That fact, speaking about the context directly happening sort of in Jesus's day, means that Passover celebrations were particularly oh boy, what do I say? Touchy, problematic, right? I mean, with Roman troops in the city of Jerusalem, when you're celebrating liberation from a despot and you have crowds to overflowing, right? There's almost like people have to camp outside the city. You could imagine why the Roman authorities would be on edge. And so that is the context in which these events are going to kind of unfold. All right, so let's turn then to the actual, like our texts here, and I'll sort of work our way through our verses. So now the festival of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was near. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to put Jesus to death, for they were afraid of the people. So we have the Passover context. That's in verse 1. In verse 2, we have a restatement of a basic sentiment that we have encountered pretty much along the way, but which is becoming more and more heightened, right? This dynamic of a divided people, a leadership which is clearly opposed to Jesus, and people who are enamored, is perhaps one way, devoted, in love with, pleased with, etc. Those are other, I think, acceptable adjectives probably. We then though have like this description of Judas turning, and that starts in verse 3 and goes into verse 4. Then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and the officers of the temple police about how he might betray him to them. All right, so there are a couple things to note here. The first is that this description is unique to Luke. So the other gospels, particularly the other synoptics, do not mention this. In Mark and Matthew, it sounds more like Judas is greedy than that he's being moved by a demonic power to do what he is about to do. And Luke, interestingly, we've already, and I think we mentioned this, many weeks ago, back certainly in the fall, when we were moving through earlier part of Luke, which is that Luke chapter 4, verse 13, which is the very end of the temptation narrative, just before the public coming out of Jesus. It talks about Satan waiting for a more opportune time. Well, here it is. This is that more opportune time. And not only is Satan going to be involved here in Judas's turning, but we will hear at the table, and I don't think we get to this today, but we'll hear at the table that Satan is actually going to test all of the disciples, right? Because the text says, Jesus says Satan has demanded to sift all of you, right? To test all of you in that sense. What's the bottom line of this statement? I think the bottom line is not just that this is a unique distinction, it just is a reminder to us that in this unfolding drama, there are definitely historical actors, but there are powers and forces beyond those historical actors who are at work here, right? And here we hear, of course, about Satan. And I think one of the things that we get reminded about sort of again and again is that this is a conflict between Yahweh and anti-God powers, right? Yahweh and the powers of darkness, which, by the way, is the way that Apocalyptic talks about the world, in a sense, that it is a confrontation between God and demonic powers, etc. So there's sort of that whole kind of apocalyptic stuff that I was talking about earlier. Okay, so he goes away, confers with them. He wants to find a way to assist them in betraying him. We don't get a ton about his motivation other than the fact that he's being moved by a demonic power. They respond in verse 5. They were greatly pleased and agreed to give him money. Now, this is interesting because this is another one of those contrast places that we've seen sort of all along the way, right? Things like in insiders who should know better, who don't. People who say they are devoted to the law, who are in fact lawbreakers. People who should know that God is mercy, who extend no mercy, etc. What is going on here? Well, this is this word here that's translated greatly pleased. Another word for that is delighted. And we have encountered delight in other places in this gospel. But what is that delight about? It's about the power working through Jesus to set people free. Here, the delight is about celebrating his death, right? I mean, it's essentially being perverted. And we're going to see a couple more of these things, like when Judas gives Jesus a kiss. That's another place where there's a kind of inversion that happens. So then we get, again, in keeping with this sort of contrast, in a way, we get verse 6. So he consented and began to look for an opportunity to betray him to them when no crowd was present. Right. So this deed, whatever it's going to be done, whatever it is going to be done not in the clear light of day. Right. And Jesus himself is going to say, I was teaching every day in the temple. Why didn't you arrest me then? Right. Because the power of darkness has been moving you. So that's the contrast here. Right. Jesus has been teaching in public. Here, his opponents are pictured as working covertly. Likewise, I think this is kind of another interesting thing just to sort of contemplate a little bit, which is that Jesus in some ways has kept his identity, the full extent of his identity, in secret, but he's done that for the sake of salvation. Whereas here, coversion, right, covering up, doing something in the dark and in secret is not for that. It is rather for murder, which is effectively what's going to happen. They're going to murder Jesus. All right, let's see what time we got. Okay. Comments, questions, or you guys want me to hop into the next passage?
Yeah, on to the next passage. Sounds good.
All right, let's do it. I get a volunteer.
I'll give it.
Oh, go
I can
ahead.
I'll give it a go. Then came the day of the unleavened bread, the Passover lamb and sacrifice. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover meal for us, we may eat it. They asked him, Where do you want us to make preparations for it? Listen, he said to them, When you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house he enters. Say to the owner of the house, Teacher asks you, Where is the guest room, where I may eat Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs already furnished. Make preparations for us there. So they went and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal.
All right, thank you. Okay, so this is, as I mentioned, as sort of there's an echo here, or we might say a rhyming with the earlier scene of securing the colt before Jesus enters into Jerusalem. Same kind of thing here. In terms of the preparation, I think there was just I think this is an observation that's worth keeping in mind, which is that in some ways in Luke, we kind of have last suppers. And I mean that in the sense that the account of the Passion, particularly in Luke, now I think you probably can make an argument that it's across the Gospels, or at least Matthew, Luke, and John would include this. But Jesus is portrayed not only as eating a meal with them before he goes, but he actually eats two meals in the Gospel of Luke. Or at least he's seen at table twice, having to do with food. Here we have in Luke we'd have the Last Supper scene, an Emmaus encounter, which is a really powerful encounter, and then a final Jerusalem scene where he eats in front of his disciples. So Last Suppers, I think I may have mentioned this to you before, but there's one commentator who made this great observation, which is that there are so many eating scenes in Luke that the commentator said it seems like Jesus eats his way through the Gospel of Luke. Like he's constantly at table, he's constantly being invited into people's houses. You know, he invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. And so that kind of plays itself out even to the end of his life. And so, and again, this is one of those scenes that has had a really significant role in the history of the church as we've come to understand or think about the Lord's Supper. So this is one of those scenes that's very important in that regard. All right, so what do we make of this passage? Just to kind of break it down, I just break it into two sections. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John saying, go and prepare the Passover meal for us that we may eat it. Basically, we get the feeling here that, Jesus and his companions are like a lot of people who would have been in Jerusalem at that time. That is, they are visitors, right? So they don't necessarily have a place that's their own, where they might have hosted something like this, and they're going to have to rent a room. So this is kind of more than likely a kind of common scene that we could find repeated probably across the town. Then they ask, well, what do you want us to do in order to make these preparations? So starting in verse 9 and moving up into 13, they asked him, where do you want us to make preparations for it? Listen, he said to them, when you've entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house he enters and say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs already furnished. Make preparations for us there. So they went and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. I'm not going to belabor this, but I think, again, there are two ways that you could read this story, much like there were two ways that you could read the cult story. This is either a prophetic moment, right, where Jesus is simply prophetically saying, this is what you're going to encounter. Or you could read this that Jesus has already in some ways made arrangements. And of course, they've been in Jerusalem now for a while. And so, certainly that's plausible. The fact that one of the things that I did find compelling was the observation that a man carrying a water jug would have been odd, because typically women were the ones who drew the water. And so it may be that Jesus had, again, already made contact with this person and he would have known, but there's no way to know for certain that may or may not be the case. I don't think, again, it's worth belaboring. The real point, of course, is the scene itself. So let's jump into this. Who would be willing to volunteer to read our last passage here?
I'll go ahead and read it.
All right.
When the hour came, he took his place at the table, and the apostles with him. He said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And he did the same with the cup after supper, saying, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. But see, the one who betrays me is with me, and his hand is on the table. For the Son of Man is going as it has been determined, but woe to that one by whom he is betrayed. Then they began to ask one another which one of them it could be who would do this.
Okay. All right. So our kind of concluding scene here. I think the wording in verse 14 gives us a sense of the solemnity of the occasion. And there's a lot of interesting stuff. I taught a class on sort of the theology of the Lord's Supper. And there's been a lot of reflection on the Lord's Supper and its connection to the Last Supper and its connection to Passover, etc. But Passover celebrations were typically somewhat festive, and they always involved the whole family. And I think you get a feeling here that this is a much more somber atmosphere. There's also, though, at the same time, even having said that, there's also evidence of disciples or students of a rabbi, rather than celebrating the Passover with their families, they celebrated it with their rabbi. So that too is also something that I think may be here in the background. Now, Luke, I don't know how to say this, but Luke is a problem sometimes. And so there's some details in here that are that it's difficult to know what to make of them. All right. And so there's two of them in particular that I want to highlight as we move through. But then I'll bring us back around to sort of the key material that I think is very definitely evident here, which has to do particularly with sort of what we have come to call the words of institution, which finds a lot of resonance in the other Gospels and in Paul's letters. All right, so what are we talking about here? We're talking in particular about this passage starting in 15 through 18. So just to be clear, 15 through 18 is pre the quote unquote Lord's Supper, because it's before he takes the bread and before he takes the cup and proclaims them to be, given to us as a new covenant, right? So just keep that in mind. If you get confused or whatever, just realize that I'm going to get to the good stuff, I promise. All right, so 15 to 18. So he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. That's very odd, isn't it? I've been dying to eat this Passover with you, but I'm not going to be able to eat it until it's fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Well, what does that mean? That's what I mean by this is one of those passages that it is not entirely clear precisely what he means. And then in verse 17 and 18, then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourselves, for I tell you that from now on, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. All right, so what do we make of these? So there's kind of two problems here. What exactly does it mean to be fulfilled in the kingdom of God? That's number one. And number two, why does Luke have two cups and not just one? Right? There's a cup that's described before the supper, and then there's a cup that's described after the supper. So those are kind of the two problems, quote unquote, that I was referring to. All right, so first of all, fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And I'm not sure precisely how to answer this, at least not in a way that's on the side of brevity. It would take a while probably to figure this out. But the first thing is to note that I typically consult 3 to 4 commentators when I'm preparing this material, and all of them were divided. And they were all divided in the sense that none of them could make up their mind about what they thought it meant either. And they were even divided on, the different possibilities of what it might mean. So just keep that in mind. If you feel like you don't even know exactly what it's saying, you're not alone, basically. So the wording here is unclear in the Greek. It's not just the English translation. The Greek itself is a little bit up and down. So I have a couple of questions as possible. Like this is what he's trying to say. So first of all, what does it mean for the Passover to be fulfilled in the kingdom of God? I think I could offer an answer to that, but that might actually mean what Jesus means, that's obviously also another question. Here, this would be my answer. Okay, so take this with a grain of salt. that Passover is an event of liberation, and that the arrival of the kingdom of God is not just something that happens at the end, it's something that happens in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so in some sense, Passover is no longer just an anticipation of the final liberation. It's something that can be experienced here and now in the community, right? In and through the power of the Spirit, and perhaps in and through the Eucharist. That would be the answer that I would construct out of the data that we have. Whether or not it's compelling to you, I don't know. But let me give you some options that have shown up. Okay, so first of all, does this phrasing imply that Jesus is actually not going to eat the meal that he's present at? Because it sounds like it does. That could be one way of reading it, right? I've eagerly longed to eat this with you, but I'm not going to be able to eat it with you until the kingdom of God comes, or until the kingdom of God itself is fulfilled. Okay. Does it mean that, let's see, so he's not going to partake in the disciples' meal? Does it mean that after that meal, like he will actually eat with them now, but later he won't eat again? That's another way that it's been taken, right? So he's going to participate with them now in the consuming of the bread and the wine, but that's it, right? Not until later is that going to is he going to participate? Or, and this is another answer, this is the one that sort of I came closest to. Does it imply, is what Jesus saying is that essentially the Passover is fulfilled in the resurrection of Jesus, because now that liberation is present in the community, particularly in the meal that the community celebrates. And the basis for this argument is a particular reading of the Emmaus Road scene, right? Which is that Jesus is present in a palpable way and is recognized when he breaks the bread and says the prayer, right? So that's another option. So I don't know where you come down. I don't even know where I come down on this, but I know it's confusing. And I hope I haven't confused you too much. All right, so what do we do with the other one? The other one I think is actually resolvable to a certain extent. Why are there two cups instead of just one? And I mentioned this is kind of a funny aside. One of the commentators mentioned that in the history, the manuscript history, that scribes were so bothered by the appearance of two cups that they actually changed manuscript. They changed it in the manuscripts. So if you know anything about manuscript history, it's kind of like family tree. And so there's somewhere way back, there's the original manuscript, but then that branches off as those manuscripts get copied. And as they get copied by different people, and as those copies are happening, scribes will make small changes here and there. Oftentimes it's grammatical. Sometimes they're trying to correct what they think got changed before. Later on, there's evidence that there's certain theological things at play. But there's some portions of the manuscript history, portions of the tree, where the scribes were so bothered by the fact that there were two cups that they tried to get rid of one of the cups. So this has been a historical conundrum that has driven people kind of crazy. All right, so what might this be? It probably is. It's probably about Passover. So modern celebrations of Passover, I think, feature like between 4 and 7 cups of wine, which different blessings are spoken over. We don't really know exactly how Jews in the first century celebrated Passover. The earliest text that we have that sort of gives us a Passover liturgy from a Jewish source is in the years like in the 800s. So that's the best we can do in terms of getting back. So we don't really know how many cups appeared there, but the use of the language of fruit of the vine, that does show up in a certain one of the Passover prayers. And so this could be a reference to the Passover practice of saying certain words over certain cups at certain points in the liturgy. if that's the case, and I think it seems to me a pretty good rationale for that. In effect, what's happening is the tradition of Passover is being bound up very deeply with the Last Supper, and therefore with the Lord's Supper. And so the Lord's Supper needs to be understood in intimate relation to the Passover and the celebration of Passover in this regard. So the Passover tradition then is interwoven with Jesus's covenantal meal, though of course there are other elements as well. And you'd have to attend my class in the Lord's Supper to get all the details of that. Just let me know and I'll send out invitations. All right, so that's kind of the confusing material. I think it's fair to say that the less confusing material is the stuff that sounds probably pretty familiar to you because you probably heard it once a month at Knox Church on Communion Sunday or some version thereof. And that's what starts in verse 19. Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And he did the same with the cup after supper, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." So I think, and I stopped there, even though the quotation continues, and we'll take that up in just a moment. These are what are known in sort of our theological parlance as the words of institution. Paul really is the first person to give us a record of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If you may recall, 1 Corinthians is written, Paul's letters are actually much earlier than the Gospels. And so his is really the more ancient. And we have pretty much the same wording here. So very precise, in a way, preservation of this text. So deep connections with 1 Corinthians as well as other early Christian texts. And there's kind of four things I just want to highlight in terms of these words of institution that I think are important. Excuse me, the first is this idea of remembering, right? Remembrance. And I'm not going to give you a huge theological apparatus here because I know there's very different schools of thought about what exactly happens in the Lord's Supper, but just building off the language of remembrance, right? Doing this in remember. What does it mean to remember? And what did it mean in ancient Israel to remember? And that's kind of what I want to get at here. The first thing is simply this idea of just breaking down the word remember in this way. To remember is to stitch back together in a coherent fashion. So to remember Jesus in the act of participating in the supper is not just to think about the Last Supper, it's to think about the whole of his life, which ends in faithfulness unto death, right? And I mean, it's got this kind of holistic sense of stitching back together. It layered in with that is the way that ancient Israel in particular seemed to have conceptualized remembering, which is expressed to us especially in the Psalms. In the Psalms, we get a lot of acts of remembrance, right? And typically they remember God's act of creating, and they remember God's act of setting them free from Egypt. The idea, though, is that when you remember those actions, those events that took place, way, way long time ago, all of a sudden, they become real in the present. So it's more than just something that happens inside my mind. It's something that that brings God present or makes God present in a palpable way and even in a radical way that is outside human ideas or abilities to construct, right? And I think this, to me, is the point of the Emmaus experience, that the remembering there is something that has to happen to them. It's not so much as something that they have to do, right? Their eyes have to actually be opened in order to see Jesus sitting at the table. So remembering, in other words, is more than just something that's going on in the mind. It has it has to do with more than simply my memory or even our collective memory. There is a certain sense in which God becomes present when we recount what God does, right? Because what God does is who God is. And certainly we see that in the life of Jesus. So that's number one, do that in remembrance of me. The second is the terminology covenant, right? And I'm sure this is something that has been talked about in a Presbyterian context for sure, where covenant and covenantal theology, very important. What's a covenant? A covenant in the ancient world was a binding relationship of love and loyalty, typically understood to be binding unto death and to be something that was done in the presence of the divine, whether we're talking about the gods or God. So there's other, ancient Near Eastern parallels of different covenants. What's happening? I mean, in a very straightforward way, Jesus here is establishing a quote unquote new covenant. But the newness of that covenant is actually based in the Old Testament, because where else do we hear about a new covenant? Jeremiah, right? So the language of Jeremiah here is echoed, right? That what Jesus is doing, in a sense, is starting the process of writing the law on our hearts. And by law, I mean learning to love our neighbor as ourselves, learning to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? The two greatest commands. So this is what's happening. That's why Jesus offers himself up. Well, what does he offer? He offers his body and his blood. All right. And I want to kind of just basically get at, these are both, I think, synecdoches, which means they are ways of using a single item or thing to talk about something bigger. So another example of a synecdoche would be something like, we got boots on the ground, right? That word boots is a synecdoche for soldiers, artillery, equipment, yada, 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 right? So body means more than just body, it means something more. Blood means more than just blood. Well, what does that mean? Now, I would take the body as simply an expression of Jesus's outward concrete life, right? His body is the site where he interacted with other people. It is the place where he expressed love and care. It is what connects him to us in a very profound way. And blood, it seems to me, is not about so much death as it is about the inner vitality, right? In the Old Testament, blood does not mean death, it means life. And so to offer up his blood, in a sense, is to offer up his life. But I don't think it's just any life. It's that inner vitality, that inner connection to God. So the whole, in other words, the whole of him, body and blood, I think is another way then of saying that. And of course, other traditions have unfolded that in different kinds of ways. And how does this happen? It happens under the signs of bread and wine. And I think these two are important. They certainly connect to traditional elements in the Passover meal. But there's been a ton of reflection theologically around some of this, both in Jewish and in Christian circles, because there's a symbolic meaning at play here. So bread is not just grain. It's grain that's come into contact with human beings, right? Human beings have to take grain, they have to work it through cultural practices until it becomes bread. Wine, right, starts out as grapes. It has to be picked, plucked, fermented, squashed, strained, etc., in order for it to become wine. In other words, there's a certain sense in which human beings and the labor that they engage in is included in this offering to some extent, right? And so some traditions will argue, in fact, that the bread and the wine, in a sense, is offered also back to God, right, as an expression of devotion. All right. Then lastly, we get the disturbing words of verses 21 through 23. But see, the one who betrays me is with me, and his hand is on the table. For the Son of Man is going as it has been determined, but woe to that one by whom he is betrayed. Then they began to ask one another, which of them could it be who would do this? Now, as I mentioned here, I think this is, it's a very striking scene. It reminds us that even in this most intimate moment, the community is in jeopardy. And in this case, that jeopardy is not just external, it's internal. And that keeps with a theme that we've encountered elsewhere about insiders and outsiders. People who think they're insiders need to be careful lest they become outsiders. That might be one way of saying it. So I think we have here an echo of the Passover meal. The Passover meal itself, right, was a meal eaten in jeopardy. The people were told to eat with their sandals on, to be prepared to leave, right? There, the threat was external. Here, the threat is both external and internal, right? I think the other thing that makes this so striking is the idea that Jesus eats his last meal with an enemy present at his table. And if you bring the Gospel of John in, and Jesus is washing people's feet, and think about that, Jesus washes Judas's feet, because I don't believe Judas is dismissed from the scene until after that scene happens. It just leaves you, I think, with a lot to think about in terms of who Jesus was, and his commitment to mercy, to being able, perhaps we might say, to tarrying with his enemies, etc. I don't know. I mean, I just think there's a lot that one can process on this. And as I mentioned here, the radically open nature of his ministry. The comment, though, that Jesus makes in verses 21 and 22 echoes pretty well Psalm 41, verse 9, which is a psalm that talks about even my closest companion has turned on me. And that's clearly something that's going on here. I don't know if Judas is his closest companion, but he's certainly a close companion as a member of the 12. Then we get, interestingly, the response of the disciples, which is, problematic, right? They focus more on who, rather than, in some sense, on what's going to happen to Jesus. And that sets us up for the scene that comes after, which is a scene where the disciples argue about who's the greatest. So it doesn't necessarily surprise us, even if we might shake our head at this moment, and also be thankful that it's included in the Gospels, because we probably know we ourselves are capable of these very things. All right. I can't believe it, but we made it through. We made it through 16 slides. We usually get through 10. So if you feel like your hair is blown back a little bit, there's a reason.
But it's because Linda wasn't here.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Two things. First of all, I'm sorry, are you opening it now?
Oh yeah.
Okay. When you talked about the verses 18, and I believe it was 16 and 18 there. What translation are you using on these?
This is NRSV.
Okay. I've got NIV here. And in both those, it talks about not eating again or not drinking again until it is done, implying that he was going to do that, but not again. And yours lacked the again. Is that a translational, or is it confusing in the original text, or?
That's a good question. The RSV, NRSV typically is a little bit closer to the Greek than the NIV. The NIV is sort of more reader friendly.
Okay.
And so I would really need to take a look at the Greek, and I would not, I just don't have that in front of me. Mine says, so as you have it in front of you, right? I will not eat it until it is finished, right, in the kingdom of God. And so that language of again doesn't really show up in these translated verses, you know. So I
Just
don't,
adds,
yeah. I'm
adds
not
another
sure.
layer to what you were saying, or
Yeah.
reinforces the question around it.
Right, that's right.
The other thing, just to comment on the disciples first being shocked and arguing about who's going to betray, and then barely getting a period in between, they're arguing about who's the greatest. I don't know if anybody has seen The Chosen or any parts of that. I encourage it. It's really interesting. But one of the aspects is all the disciples are portrayed as real people. Simon's a jerk, this kind of thing. And in that, when they do argue, these aren't theological discussions or sitting back on. They're petty playground fights.
Yeah.
And if The Chosen it's not a preachy thing. It's not a typical religious or a Christian presentation deal. It's done up with very high quality standards, and was really good. But what I really appreciated out of it is I've got a better image of the disciples being real people and with real faults and being jerks, being young too. I mean,
Yeah.
as I was telling somebody, most of my images of the apostles are flannel graph pictures, and this kind of
Teacher
kicked it into
Lil.
real life. How's that? Teacher Lil,
Teacher
thank
Lil.
you. Yep. Anyhow, just a side comment. I encourage you to watch at least the first episode and see what you think about it. But it's I found it pretty good.
Well, and I think interestingly, just to dovetail on your comment, John, Luke actually preserves two different scenes where the disciples are arguing which one of them is the greatest. One of those scenes happens just before the travel narrative starts, and the other scene happens at the Lord's Supper, right, at the Last Supper. Yep. And so it's like, in a way, it kind of brackets, it just sort of communicates to you in a sense that, yeah, like you said, they're real fallible people. When I've been teaching through Luke at Meeting House the last couple of weeks, one of my participants has just kind of marveled a little bit, and we sort of remarked together on the fact that this is preserved in all the gospel stories. Like all the gospel stories preserve the foibles of the disciples. And obviously there's clearly a precedent for that in the scriptures of Israel. I mean, you know, you can go and read about David, and you can read about the patriarchs, et cetera, and you come away with a sense that they're, you know, these were people that had flaws, to say the least. But it just, there's something about it, you know, I think we've kind of reflected on this kind of reminder that the real leader, you know, of the community is the risen Christ, and that one is not supposed to put one's faith, in a sense, in, you know, you can kind of have your trust or whatever that someone will do right, but not your faith, your hope, etc., is not to be placed in human authorities, even the authorities of the community.
Yeah.
And Luke goes out of his way in some ways to replicate, to show how the very problems that you see in the Pharisees and even in the Sadducees can be replicated without a problem, even inside the community. Yeah, it's a kind of cautionary tale, I think.
I did do a quick lookup of the translations of that, and King James, NRSV, and ASV go with what we were reading, which is the I won't do it. NIV and ESV go with the I won't do it again version. And so I think you are seeing some of the lack of clarity over that. I think too that the again account goes much more consistently with the other synoptic gospels description of the Last Supper in terms of he passes around and says, I won't do it again, rather than says, I won't do it again before he starts the process. So I've always taken it as somewhat of a scrambled narrative. It reads like a story that he got from some of the other, not scrambled, like what I mean to say is two different things put in in that order. But he gets the story of I won't do this again, essentially from, I would take it as from others, right? Because Luke wasn't there, but he's had contact with major apostles, people who were there. But then for the second piece of it to be so word for word Pauline, which is the Pauline version is what we always use at communion. It's what everybody seems to use at communion.
Right.
And that was given to him afterwards in his revelation, right? So, and it's so word for word. And of course, Paul was Luke's mentor, essentially. And so, at least in the faith, it seemed like. And so it's like he wants to tell you this piece of the story that happened where Jesus said these things, but he also wants to get it out the way that he has learned it, which is this is how it works and this is what's going to happen. So that's the way I would see that.
Right. And I think the consistency of the words of institution across the Gospels, Paul's text, and a couple of other we could draw in kind of early Christian texts from the first century is indicative of the idea that this was by that point in time a community that celebrated these things and held those words to be sacrosanct.
Sacrosanct, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right.
Well, and the whole memory thing it's another recast of the Passover, because what is the whole point of the Passover? I mean, they're given very specific instructions. This is how you're going to celebrate the Passover. And when your children ask you, you're going to explain to them, this is what happened and this is why this happened, right? So it's for memory of the Passover, and this is for memory of the new covenant. The old covenant established not really in the Passover established with Abraham, but the saving moment being the thing that God wants them to remember in the Passover. And so he has very strict rules for how that's going to be done. And then we have a very strict setup for how this is going to be done. And this is, again, for remembrance, so that down through the ages, we will remember this.
And God is present in a unique way in that act.
Yeah, no, clearly.
Yeah.
It seemed to me, if you think about what is Passover, what's happening at Passover, right? So it's the last curse. The people who are oppressing God's people it's the last curse. They're going to take the firstborn of all of them, but God is going to save the Israelites, but they have to be ready to move immediately, because that's the moment when they're going to let them go. So that's why they're wearing their cloaks and got their belts on. They got to be ready to get out the door. The only thing they got to do is stop and get all of the jewelry from their neighbors, because they'll be so afraid of them that they'll give it to them gladly. And so they head out the door. In this case, who is oppressing God's people? It's actually God's people that are oppressing it. In a certain sense, Jesus is the one person being oppressed. He is the oppressor. And the people whose firstborn should die are everybody else in the room and everybody around them. And instead, he's going to give himself, and he's going to be the one firstborn given for everybody, so that the sacrifice is completed. And so the people who are the oppressors become actually the people to be freed. So it's almost like he's transformed the Egyptians into the Israelites by doing that, or the people who are oppressing him, he's now giving himself up so that they're going to be able to leave. matter. It's that substitutionary sacrifice that turns them back into something that they aren't at that point.
Well, and there's also, I think, to that point, there's plenty of precedent in the sense that, one of the central complaints of the prophets and of Yahweh is the way that Israel, in a sense, transforms itself into the nations.
Mhm.
Right? That's why they're judged in the way that they are. That's why they face exile. Is precisely that they become like the very ones whom God had rescued them from, effectively, I think.
Right. Yeah. And in the same way, you've got the symbolism of the snake being raised up on the cross, right? He makes the reference not here, but elsewhere. That in the same way, the Son of Man will be raised up. Well, what was that? They raised the snake up on the cross to stop the curse, to stop the plague, right? The snakes are eating them all, killing them all. The only way to get them to stop is put the snake up on the cross, and then it stops. Well, what gets raised up on the cross this time? It's the Son of Man. It's a man. It's a human being. So what's the snake? Well, it's the man. The man has been tied up with the snake essentially and is the one doing all of the killing. And the only way to get it to stop is to raise the man up on the cross. I mean, there's some very sharp symbolism in these kinds of things to point us back to A, who Jesus is, and B, how the story has unfolded all along.
No, for sure. Well, everybody, we're 16 pages, but it's 8:30. That explains why. I wondered why I was so tired. I thought it was just because we just been running, but like we just ran and ran. But it's been a pleasure to be with all of you. So we have 2 weeks left. I'll have a challenge, but obviously we will focus. Next week it'll be mostly trial, crucifixion. And then that last week, we'll be able to hopefully enter into some of Luke's resurrection narratives, and that Emmaus story is so interesting. So blessings to everybody.
Thank you, Christian.
You're
Good night.
welcome. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Christian.
Yep. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.